välkomna till Folkets Radio. Welcome to the public radio. Today with author Joanna Williams. Welcome.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to join you.
It's a privilege to have you on. Joanna has written the excellent book, How Woke Won, in Swedish, Så vann Woke, about the elitist movement that is threatening democracy, tolerance, and common sense. Before we dive into your book, perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to write this book.
Sure. So I began my career as a school teacher, and from there went to work in universities. I worked at the University of Kent for about, over 10 years. And it was whilst I was there, really, that I became very interested in issues such as academic freedom and free speech more broadly, and where the main threats to free speech were coming from nowadays. And particularly in the university context, it seemed to me that the main threats to free speech were not necessarily coming from politicians or university managers, but often actually from students and academics themselves, who were imposing their own political ideas upon other people within the academy. And I guess that got me interested in looking at the kind of ideas that academics were espousing that seemed to, on the one hand, be very progressive, very liberal, but were often enforced with a real authoritarianism. So at this point, about kind of 2016, 2017, I became very interested in feminism, and we had the Me Too movement. And I was very interested in the kind of panic, it seemed to me, that seemed to surround the Me Too movement, and the way that this again turned very quickly into a seemingly progressive movement for gender equality into almost a witch hunt against all men, and targeted all men as being potentially abusive. And it was very much in line with thinking about that I began thinking about woke politics, woke ideas more broadly, ideas that seem to have a real power and also a real kind of authoritarianism in society. And when you have these kind of thoughts in British academia, you don't really last very long. So I left working at the university. I spent a couple of years working in think tanks, and since then I've really been a freelance journalist and author. I write a weekly column for an online publication, Spiked, and I write for The Spectator, sometimes The Telegraph and The Times in the UK. And I've written a number of books, like so, on academic freedom, feminism, and most recent one is How Woke Won.
So perhaps we could begin by just clarify a few concepts and words. The first time I heard this word woke, I thought it was pretty much identical with political correctness. But as I understand, it's not quite the same, is it?
I think it very much overlaps with political correctness, and there's real similarities there. I mean, woke tends to, the word itself is much more of an American import, although the ideas have taken on a life of their own in many countries, other countries around the world. To me, it seems to carry much more of an official weight. It's often the ideology associated with the way that particular institutions seem to operate. It's become the kind of dominant ideology that coheres in an elite group of people. Certainly within the UK, that seems to be the case. And as I mentioned before, it often seems to be enforced in a very authoritarian way. So whereas political correctness seemed to be about enforcing a kind of politeness upon people and getting people to check their words, but it could even sometimes be perhaps a little bit good-humoured. Woke seems to be a very authoritarian ideology, and if you fall foul of it, then you rapidly find yourself cancelled and thrown out of polite society.
Yeah. So how does woke culture relate to cancel culture?
So, I mean, the way I understand woke is that it is really a set of ideas that's related particularly to identity and identity politics. It foregrounds aspects of people's identity, particularly gender, race, sexuality, and it's very obsessed with these kind of identity features. I mean, one of the reasons why I object to it so strongly is because it often seems to me that these are kind of really things that we have no control over. You know, I didn't choose to be born female. You know, I didn't choose to be born with white skin. These are just kind of accidental things about me. Yeah. They're not things that I've actually determined or shaped about my own life. And the kind of woke identity politics takes these accidental features of who we are and then seems to arrange them in kind of pyramids or hierarchies, or assign kind of oppression or privilege to us based on these accidental features of our lives. So I might kind of gain oppression points, if you like, because I'm female, but then I might lose privilege points. I might gain oppression points for being female, but then have privilege for being white. This is how a kind of woke worldview would judge me. And then I'd be ranked, I guess, according to other people. So transgender people would be more oppressed than me. Black people would be considered to be more oppressed than me. But I would be considered to be more oppressed than white men, for example. And I think when you try and challenge this and push back against some of these ideas, this is when cancel culture really seems to come into play. I was going to say it seems to be largely a social media phenomenon, but I don't think that's necessarily true anymore. To me, cancel culture is about calling for people who speak out of turn, who challenge woke ideas, to lose their jobs, lose their livelihood, to be really thrown out of kind of polite society, to be non-personed, if you like. So it very much involves censorship, shutting people down, silencing debate. But at extreme ends, it can involve calling for people to lose their jobs as well. I mean, in the UK, we even have hate speech laws where if you say something which might be considered by somebody to be transphobic, for example, perhaps using pronouns according to someone's sex rather than their preferred gender identity, which I have to say I don't consider to be transphobic, I just consider to be scientifically accurate. You could even find the police coming knocking at your door, questioning your thinking, asking you if you know that you could be in breach of you could have potentially committed a hate crime. So this is the kind of level of authoritarianism and the level of what it means to be cancelled in society today.
Another very interesting term you use, I mean, as I understand it, this woke identity has grown out sort of this woke movement has grown out of the neoliberal decades, the last few decades with neoliberal, also technocracy. And you use this, I think it's an anthropological term, the professional managerial class, PMC. This is a group of professionals that are sort of at the bulk of this woke agenda. Can you explain what this is?
Yeah, so I think this term professional managerial class, it's been used by sociologists in the US. I think it was coined by Barbara Ehrenreich. And it dates back to the 60s and 70s, so it's a term which has been knocking around for some time now. But to me, I think it really means a class of people are highly educated, often highly educated in elite universities, who work in either the creative industries or some sections of business and often in the public sector, who are often not doing things themselves, such as actually making anything or producing anything or kind of being a doctor or being a teacher, but are the people who do the management, run these organizations, run institutions. And I think they are a growing body, a growing group of people. And they're a group of people who morally think they've deserved their place at the top of society, not just because of their own ability to have got into top universities and to have kind of played the academic game in that particular way, but they seem to have a consciousness of their own moral superiority as well. And increasingly, it seems to me, act in their own interests. I mean, they set their own pay often. For example, they sit on the pay remuneration committees and award each other hefty pay rises. But they justify this by espousing the woke values that lead the kind of shape of the diversity, equity and inclusion training workshops that other employers have to attend, for example, and this gives them the moral justification for the position that they hold.
Interesting. I just wanted to read a short excerpt of your book. I must say I have the Swedish edition, so you have to bear with my layman translation back to English. And this is about this professional managerial class. They have the same taste when it comes to fashion, music, food, vacation spots. They use a vocabulary that they know directly by others within this cultural elite. They know instinctively that it's taboo to say colored people, but it's okay to say non-white. They know that the acronym BAME, Black, Asian, and Minority Ethnic, might have been okay 2 years ago, but today it's something repugnant. So what comes to my mind when I read this, I get the picture of like in the old days, a dinner party with the aristocracy, where you would never, if you're not one of them, you would never know how to put your fork or your napkin correctly. You would always break some unwritten rule and you would make a fool of yourself. Is this something similar?
Absolutely. I really think you've nailed it there. I think that is very much what it is. And again, it shows the role of how I think education has changed very much nowadays. Education, and particularly the top-ranking universities, seem to be far less concerned with teaching people, students, a body of subject knowledge than they are with teaching students the correct way to not just to think and not just what values to hold, but the correct way to express themselves as well. They become almost like finishing schools. But again, instead of teaching exactly as you say, the correct knife and fork to use, these are finishing schools which are teaching people the correct way to speak with all the latest fashionable woke buzzwords. And I think what's important about this, like I say, is it allows this professional managerial class to pull rank, to identify each other, to know who's part of their in crowd and who's not woke, and who needs to have the training and the re-education, and who's a kind of safe person on their side that they can relate to. And I think this is why they then feel so much happier in the company of like-minded people like them, who, and again, from the bit that you read out, they live and marry and start families very much with people who share the same values as they do. Incidentally, just as a little point off that, I think one thing that's very interesting is often the gap between the values that these people live by and the values that they espouse. So in particular, when it comes to the family, you see that often the kind of woke view is that families come in all shapes and sizes, and you could have 2 mums or 2 dads, or 3 mums, 4 dads. You don't have to live together. Everything's very relaxed and completely relativized. Everything's absolutely fine. Whereas in actual fact, the way that the professional managerial class often choose to live themselves is very much kind of married mum and dad, kind of raising children. So they will preach one thing but live by a slightly different moral code.
Interesting. So this professional managerial class, which is an elite group in society, how did they manage to seduce the left?
No, that's a very, very good question. I'm not really sure though if they have seduced the left. I think it's almost the other way around, as if the left politically gave up, abandoned its principles, but I think more importantly, I think the left abandoned the working class. I think often in the past, if you look back, certainly if you go back far enough, left-wing politics was grounded within working class communities. And I think either through trade unions or just a sense of working class people having an awareness of their own interests and wanting to be able to express those interests politically. But I think really the story of the past 20 years politically has been left-wing parties giving up on working class people, kind of washing their hands of working class communities. And I think we saw that most strongly in the UK in relation to 2016 and the vote for Brexit, when the areas that voted most strongly to leave the European Union were much more likely to be working class areas. And I don't think this started the left's abandonment of the working class. I think that had been going on for several years beforehand. But it kind of gave the professional managerial class and the left permission to be very explicit about their loathing of working class people through the lens of criticising Brexit. It became quite acceptable for them to talk about ignorant, lizard-brained, stupid, backward people, and how their role was then to kind of step above this kind of mess of working class people and kind of use their universities, their power that they had within cultural institutions to educate working class people out of what was perceived to be their ignorance. So I think rather than the kind of left seducing the professional managerial class, I think the left, first of all, abandoned the working class and then has kind of since then been looking for a new constituency, looking for a new sense of purpose. I mean, if you were to go back certainly 100 years, it would be unthinkable to have a Labour Party in the UK. Obviously, it's called the Labour Party, and Labour means work. I mean, literally means work. It would be unthinkable to have a Labour Party that was so disconnected from the working class. But having abandoned the working class, the Labour Party then really looked to identity politics and looked to the exponents of identity politics as being the key group that it could work with.
But I mean, the left used to be very concerned, mostly concerned with the distribution of wealth. That used to be the core issue. So I mean, how has this changed, and why did they abandon this core issue?
Mm-hmm. No, again, I mean, really great questions. That there's not a straightforward answer, but I think you can look at a history of trade union disputes, for example, and essentially failures, losses in the UK. I mean, my personal earliest political memory goes back to when I was, I guess, 9-10 years old in 1984. 1984 would have been there was the miners, the coal miners went on strike in the UK, and this was a really, really big deal. You know, the coal miners had enormous power in British society at the time. But they lost, they lost that strike, and that experience of defeat, I think, left many in the working class very disenchanted, many in the Labour Party, many in the left, very disenchanted with working class people and the power for the working class to bring about political change in society. And I think it really goes back to that point kind of in around the mid-1980s, when there was this very conscious search for a new group of people, new groups that they could work with, rather than having to focus on the working class and having to focus on issues around money and economics. And I think that really coincides with, for me, what is the very, very worst aspect of woke, where it also turns on its head ideas that certainly I would have held dear about race and gender, for example. So the kind of anti-racism that I grew up on was very much a colourblind anti-racism. The idea that you should not see people first and foremost and judge people by the colour of their skin, but that you should be judging people according to their character. You should look at whether somebody's a good person, a nice person, what that person does, what that person says, and their skin colour is irrelevant to this. The same, I would say, for sex as well, that I grew up assuming I could be equal to men, and that the fact of being female was not an important thing about me. Whereas I think what woke politics does in a very backward and horrible way is it kind of breathes life back in to these ideas that skin colour is important, and that your gender is important, that these things become what you should be judged by, and you get a very backward sense of these old prejudices almost being rehabilitated, these views being rehabilitated again. And I think these two things really happened in parallel, a kind of abandonment of the working class, a search for a new constituency based around identity. If we can't win the working class en masse, perhaps we can win over this group of feminists, or we can win over this group of anti-racists, and we can work with them. And at the same time, a redefinition of what it meant to champion women's rights, or what it meant to be anti-racist.
Yeah, it seems like they're very good at co-opting good ideas and corrupting them. So you write also about that this new left or new labor, they talk about female as a social construction, but they're not so engaged with women who work as cleaners or healthcare workers, those core issues that they should be their concern.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's worse than that. I mean, ultimately, they're not bothered even about women whatsoever. And particularly with the ideas around transgenderism, to actually, again, it was something that I, growing up, very much reacted against. For me, I didn't want to be defined by my biology. As I've already said, to me, my biology is almost an accident. It's the least interesting thing about me. Whereas now I feel very strongly that I need to assert the fact that I'm female and that I'm a woman, and that means that physically I have a female body, because that is being erased. I mean, linguistically, it's being erased. We have the NHS in the UK issuing leaflets referring to kind of pregnant people. So, I mean, I've had 3 children. I was very much a pregnant woman. I wasn't a pregnant person. And when I gave birth, I became a mother. I didn't become a parenting person, or whatever the phrase is, and being a woman and being a mother, these are really important things. And I think the woke left now is almost wanting to erase womanhood, it seems, altogether, because the idea of being female, having a woman's body, and kind of owning that and associating those two things together. There's a kind of, it seems like they're worried that this might offend transgender people. So it's best if we just don't talk about it and don't mention these things altogether in case it offends someone. Well, that offends me. That idea that I can't say I'm a woman, I find very offensive.
Yeah. So before we move into the topic of transgender, just one more question about, so how does this wokeist elite in general, how do they regard workers, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think they tend not to. I think they are quite happy just to see if their bins get collected, if their children are looked after, they're in nursery school, they're very happy not to really think about this at all. But when they do have to think about it, I think often it's as problems to be solved, as people who need to be sent on training courses, who need to have the correct way of speaking drummed into them. And I think, I guess the word that comes to mind in answer to your question really is fear and suspicion. I think it seems to me that the professional managerial class, they must actually be quite scared of ordinary, what I would call kind of ordinary, normal working people, because so much of what the way society is organised is about controlling people's behaviour. Can we have hate speech laws to control the way that ordinary people speak to one another? Can we have laws to kind of increase the price of alcohol because these, or increase the price of fatty food or sugary food because these working class people, they're so stupid, they will eat too much and drink too much, and they will smoke, and it's this kind of fear that without this guidance and instruction, people will just be completely out of control. We'll all go around being racist and sexist and transphobic and eating too much and being hateful to one another. It's not a nice view.
So a large part of your book is about transgender, and this is a huge topic in itself. But so what is your take on this, and why has this issue sort of exploded in our time?
Yeah, you're really absolutely right. So I wrote a book about feminism I think came out in 2018, and it was transgender at that point was barely an issue. I mean, it was just bubbling up under the surface, but it was barely an issue, and it's become a huge issue in just 4 years. It's quite scary how quickly these ideas have taken hold. And the question why, that it's a huge question. And again, I'm afraid I don't think there's one straightforward answer, but I think there's lots and lots of different reasons. I think kind of woke, the woke political worldview, it doesn't like absolutes. It's a world that often deals in kind of moral relativism. And doesn't like a kind of definite objectivity or truth as the version that emerges from academia. Being female or being male, these are binary situations. It is a truth. Your chromosomes, your genitals, your biology, is either male or female, and these are absolute, objective, true states. And the idea that is a binary, a border, a boundary that is unchallengeable has clearly upset a lot of people who want to be able to stamp their feet and be able to say, but I don't want to be a man, I'm a woman. So I think that's one reason. I think another thing is that, again, as I kind of touched upon earlier about how the professional managerial class kind of live in a way different to how they preach. I think one thing in relation to working class people, working class communities that they're quite wary about is the family, and the family as a strong institution, the family as a site where children are raised and grow up and take on board the values of their parents and the kind of the culture and values of their community. And I think as soon as you start saying that you can't assume that female babies are girls and male babies are boys, and you have to raise children in this kind of very gender neutral way and allow them to choose for themselves whether they're going to be a man or a woman, you open the door to really, I think, the end of the family as an institution. You open the door to all kinds of kind of external interference in the lives of the structure of the family, but more importantly, kind of how children are raised. You know, teachers and the state can then take on a much bigger role in relation to children. Parents are considered to be a threat to their own children because the parents might have kind of supposedly backward ideas that girl babies are going to grow up to be women and boy babies are going to grow up to be men. So it's almost as if the state needs to step in and save children from their own families. And transgender ideas are one of the most efficient ways in which that can happen. So I think those are kind of two reasons. But I think a third reason I'd throw into the mix is, again, something I touched upon earlier, about the kind of construction of hierarchies of victimhood. And certainly in the UK, the US, you know, most countries around Europe, you could point to gay rights having largely been won. You know, certainly with gay marriage, there are very few areas of life where gay people can point to real material inequalities, legal inequalities over heterosexual people. So with gay rights kind of largely won, you know, you've got a lot of LGBT campaigners then almost looking for a cause, and transgender people, even though, you know, started off as only a really, really tiny community, could be presented as the most victimized group of them all. You know, people who don't fit into society, people who are marginalized, could be held up as the most victimized group. And that sense of these kind of, particularly for transgender children, the kind of the pure victim who needs protecting and other people need to act on their behalf, gives activists a lot of power, but also completely disables other people in speaking out, because, you know, people become very cowardly. I think certainly more people in the UK are speaking out now, but you know, go back 3-4 years in the UK, you have to be quite a tough person to say, no, you know, I am not going to bow down to this most victimized group. I don't think transgender children are pure victims in the way you're presenting them to. I think they need saving from you, the transgender activists, you know, not from the fact of not from who they are.
You write also, you give a lot of examples, like a Scottish student who was almost thrown out from the university for saying that women have vaginas. And I think you touch upon something also deeper, a deeper layer of, you write in your book that gender ideology demands a complete dismissal of the reality in front of our eyes. And I remember, you know, this character in George Orwell's 1984, he has to accept that 2 + 2 = 5. And it's sort of the last frontier of his sanity is broken down. So I just wanted to read you a short quote from 1984. It says, "The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command."
Well, I think this is absolutely right and completely relevant to what we've been talking about in relation to transgenderism, but also the points that you were making earlier about the kind of etiquette around this. And, you know, you are saying about the kind of old-fashioned using the correct knives and forks, and how this has translated nowadays into using the correct woke vocabulary. And I guess the going along with transgender by seeing the person with the beard and the big chest and the penis and saying, yes, you are a woman, I will call you she, is the ultimate sign of acquiescence to the woke project. And I think this is another thing that makes it very attractive to the professional managerial class, because again, it allows them to see, it becomes a test, if you like. Do you pass the test by saying, yes, you are a woman, or do you fail the test by saying the truth, as George Orwell says it, that you see with your own eyes? You know, have they won by getting you to lie, or do you still have that resistance within you?
And one of the weirdest things about all this that you bring up is that actually has this, you would think the opposite, but it has somehow given a resurrection to homophobia, that you say a lesbian woman is seen as intolerant if she doesn't want to date a person with a penis. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's, funnily enough, been a case in the UK, literally just in the past couple of weeks, of a woman who started, a lesbian woman who wanted to run a lesbian dating evening in a local pub. And because she's lesbian, unsurprisingly, she wanted to stipulate that only women were allowed to come to this dating evenings, that people could meet each other, meet potential partners. And transgender people complained about this. They said that anybody can be a lesbian, you know, a male can be a lesbian, so you can't run a lesbian dating society and say that this is for females only. And this is just one example. You know, there have been lots and lots of examples in the UK like this, where lesbians in particular have really been targeted by men who then turn around and say that they are not only women but lesbians, and so demand access to female spaces online and in real life as well, and you know, want to be able to date lesbians. I guess, you know, one of the things about this is when we think about the woke diversity training, it's the phrase is always, the three words are always kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I guess one of the things that woke really reacts against is any form of exclusion. And ultimately being able to say, I'm female and I only want to date other females, is a form of exclusion. You know, it's by definition, being a lesbian, you're excluding 50% of the kind of human adults from your potential dating partners. And that really, really winds up these men who think that they shouldn't be excluded from female-only spaces. And they get very, very angry about it. And one horrible phrase, I mean, really, a very, very gross phrase, is the cotton ceiling. And again, you've had this, the cotton ceiling, sorry, I should spell out, is referring to women's underwear. It's a takeoff of the phrase the glass ceiling. So feminists have talked for many years about how to break the glass ceiling, meaning how to get women into kind of the top sections of the workplace, into the leading management jobs. And transgender people have taken that phrase, the glass ceiling, and used it to come up with the cotton ceiling, which is basically, how can men break into women's underwear? How can males who identify as female lesbians get into the knickers of lesbians? I mean, this is where you have to kind of pinch yourself. Is this really happening? Because to my mind, at any other point in history, you know, that would be talked about as rape. You know, this would be training sessions on breaking the cotton ceiling would be considered instructions in how to commit rape or how to commit sexual abuse. Whereas when it's led by members of the transgender community, this is seen as being somehow an acceptable thing for people to talk about. I think it's really gross. But again, the abuse that lesbians in particular have suffered, I think, is very homophobic. I mean, really does breathe new life back into old-fashioned homophobia.
And for people who have no prior knowledge and perhaps are not so active in social media, what can you explain? What is this all about? Misgendering and pronouns and all that?
Yeah, so again, I think a lot of this comes down to language and wanting control of the language. So, without wanting to get too technical about it, a lot of the ideas around transgender that we have nowadays seem to come from an ideology which was espoused really first by Judith Butler, an American gender studies theorist. And she talked about gender as a performance for a particular audience. And whether you're seen as a man or a woman isn't based upon any inherent characteristics of you, but upon how the audience perceives you, how the audience responds to you. And obviously one way in which you can test that, you can see how does the audience respond to me, is by the pronouns that they use when they refer to you. So I would expect, being a woman, I would expect people to be referring to me as she and her. Obviously, if I suddenly decide I'm a man and still look the way I do now, I would have to go around and tell people, my pronouns are he and him and his, and this is how you must refer to me. And so you've got this whole obsession now with people in their place of work being given actual badges to wear on their uniform, or being told to include their pronouns as part of their email signature when they're sending company emails. And this is the idea behind this, is that we need to normalize announcing our pronouns. So when we started this conversation this afternoon, I should have, and you asked me to introduce myself, I should have said, oh, hello, I'm Joanna, my pronouns are she and her. And in the act of normalizing that way of using pronouns, it normalizes the idea that my gender identity might not match my sex, that there's an expectation that the two things could be different, and I have to announce my pronouns so you don't assume that they're one and the same. But it's become a huge obsession. And, the one problem is that now using the wrong pronouns, which you could do just accidentally, using the wrong pronouns can be seen as a hate crime, as a deliberate act of misgendering somebody, of a denial of who they are. But the thing I find most disgusting of all in relation to pronouns is that we've had a number of high-profile cases in the UK of men who've committed either gross acts of paedophilia, of child abuse, or rape, who've gone to court and declared that they are women, have said that they are not men, but they are women, and that their pronouns are she and her. And you have then this written up in newspapers, journalists report this, basically lying as far as I'm concerned. So they don't say a man, Tom Smith raped a woman. They'll say a woman raped a woman. She committed this rape. She committed this act of child abuse. And it creates a completely misleading impression of the way, of the nature of crime, of who the criminal was. And most horrible of all then is when the victims of these crimes have to either stand in court and hear the person who perpetrated this crime, the man who perpetrated this crime against them, being referred to as a woman, or read press coverage where they're told that she committed a rape. And you just think, how horrible is that? First, to be a victim of this kind of crime in the first place, but then to be told that you were raped by a woman when you know full well that that was not what happened to you. I think it's horrible.
So if you zoom out from all the details, I mean, some of the details, albeit they're tragical, it's almost out of Monty Python. It can be funny. But I mean, you also, I think, say that this is the totalitarian agenda behind all this. Why do you say that?
Yeah, I think it's for one thing, it brooks very little dissent. It's very hostile to free speech. The idea that you can challenge these ideologies is a very, very difficult thing to do. It's not made easy, and often these ideas are enforced in the workplace or in universities or schools through training sessions, and even that word training suggests not education where there's room for discussion or room for dissent or for sharing of knowledge, but that there's a particular view that you are expected to learn and demonstrate that you've accepted. So there's very, very little room for dissent. And the punishments for stepping out of line can be very, very severe. So we see, again, a number of high-profile cases in the UK or in Ireland, just recently of a singer, a comedian, Graham Linehan in Britain, who have transgressed, have sinned, have said that not the Irish singer, but the comedian, that a woman is female, and to say otherwise is a lie. And they find their entire careers taken away from them and trashed. They have the publishers of their books, venues that were going to host concerts, all pull out. Or you see with even with somebody like J.K. Rowling, who's kind of too big, too famous to cancel, just the torrent of abuse that's considered to be acceptable, the death threats, pictures of her house, bomb-making instructions left up online for hours. The abuse that's considered acceptable is just abhorrent. And it's this kind of enforcing of woke ideas that I find very totalitarian. I mean, I strongly believe in free speech. If somebody wants to believe in critical race theory, or, I grew up a Catholic, and, I was taught that you're literally consuming the body of Christ when you go to church. If people want to believe that a man can literally become a woman, fair enough, believe what you like. I might, as long as I then have the capacity to say that I believe something different and I think you're wrong, and you don't enforce that view on other people. But I think the problem is that woke ideas are being enforced. They're not being put up for discussion or debate or as just an interesting way of looking at it. They're being put up as the correct way. And if you transgress, if you don't believe, then you will be punished.
And do we have a problem in society with discrimination against people that consider themselves non-binary or gender fluid and so on?
Personally, I don't think so, no. I think we actually live in an incredibly tolerant society. And to some extent, I actually feel sorry for some people who are transgender and particularly older people who are transgender, because I think, clearly there have always been people who like to wear clothes associated with the opposite sex. And many of them just very quietly and happily went about their lives and didn't see this as a political statement in any way. It was just a peculiarity about them. It was just their individual personality, their quirk. I think what's happened in the past few years is the way that this has become so politicized, and activists have got hold of this agenda. It actually targets these people and turns their just peculiar fetish for wanting to wear clothes of the opposite sex into a political statement that they never meant it to be. And I think that people have then been pushed to the forefront of this kind of political activism, who just really want to just have a quiet life and actually were leading a quiet life, were not being harassed or abused, were quite happily going about their lives. And now suddenly it's being politicized by a cohort of activists.
So you mentioned the word tolerance, and another word, which is, I don't know, in English and Swedish you use mångfald. This means like multitude. It's very politically correct to talk about multitude in a working place or a multitude. But there seems to be a paradox when I read your analysis. It seems that what it really, the woke culture, more than anything else, leads to like a monoculture. It's the opposite of multitude of opinions, for instance, and so on.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the English translation for that word would be diversity. And you're spot on. You know, there is a complete obsession with diversity, which I find a bit odd, because what does diversity actually mean? You know, it seems to me to be quite a vacuous term. We're all different, you know, so what? Mm-hmm. And again, it seems an odd thing that we would celebrate. To me, it would be much more important to celebrate what we have in common. You know, that seems to be a much more productive thing, you know, whether that's our common humanity or, you know, what it is that we share as a society. Not just like, why would you celebrate the fact that we're all different? Again, it just seems a statement of fact, a statement of the obvious. You know, people are all different. But you're absolutely right that it's used in a very specific way. Again, you know, the differences that we're allowed to celebrate relate to gender identity, to skin color, you know, to sexuality. What we're not allowed to celebrate in any way, shape or form is differences of opinion, differences of thought. And ironically, you know, I think the place where this is strongest is in universities, which should be places which are at the forefront of letting ideas multiply and celebrating differences of opinion as an opportunity for people to learn from each other, to challenge bad ideas, to propose new ideas, better ideas. Whereas universities, ironically, seem to be the places which are most intent upon imposing a kind of intellectual and viewpoint conformity rather than diversity.
So you also write that they talk about sort of the self-identity of a nation, for instance, that you said that wokists think that the history of the UK is shameful. But wouldn't you agree that parts of the UK history is shameful, like colonization and the destruction of indigenous cultures and so on?
Sure, absolutely. But I think that same thing could be said for absolutely every country around the world, because the history of humanity, you know, is not a straightforward arc of progress. There are not kind of beautifully innocent people. I mean, the past is messy by definition. And I think for every country in the world, there are both good things and bad things. But incidentally, I don't think many things, you know, are all bad. Or, I mean, clearly, you know, Holocaust, all bad. You know, there are some things which were all bad. But when you're talking about huge sweeps of history, you know, whole 100-year periods, you know, it's very... I think it's important to try and keep a balance and to try and understand things within the historical context in which they were happening. And my worry about history is that it's kind of being, it's only the bad parts. I mean, absolutely, there are bad parts of our history, bad things that happened in the past, but there were also good things that happened in the past as well. And I think the problem is we focus only on the bad, and we use history in a very instrumental way as a kind of morality tale to teach us moral lessons about our concerns in the present. So in the present, you know, racism, racial inequality is a very, very big concern. So in order to prove points about racism, we kind of mine the past for examples to prove and show where this racism emerged from. Look, you know, we can point to colonialism, we can point to slavery, we can show how this bad thing that's happening in the present has got a long history. But that, to me, that's not proper history, because proper history would be about seeing things in the context of the time in which they happened, rather than just as a stark morality tale for the purposes of the present.
So before we wrap up, let's talk about the way forward. How do ordinary people fight back against woke?
Yeah, difficult question. But I think the important thing is that we do. It seems to me that Britain, I'm pleased to say, can actually show does have some good lessons to offer the world, I think, in this regard, particularly around gender and around women's rights. I think the UK has been quite successful in some regards in pushing back against transgender ideology, particularly in relation to children. I mean, just to stress, this has not been won. You know, there are still everyday new and shocking examples that come to light. It's a bit like, I think this will be a very, very difficult thing. I don't know how to translate this into Swedish. But in UK, there's a kind of fairground game that we have called whack-a-mole. I don't know if you know this, where you have a hammer. It's a toy game for children, but it's a big thing at fairgrounds. And like a mole pops up in random places all across the board, and you have a hammer, and every time it pops up, you have to bang it back down again. You know, it's very much like that in Britain with transgender. You squash, you know, children can't have puberty blockers. And then something else pops up somewhere else. Oh, but men can go to women's prisons if they identify as female. So you squash that one down, and then you have, hospitals are talking about pregnant people rather than pregnant women. So different things are happening all the time. But there is a lot of pushback to it. And I think, for me, the two things that stand out about why this has been kind of had some degree of success. The first thing is just bravery. It has taken some women with real courage and real bravery, going back kind of 4 or 5 years when all of this was just beginning to take off, to actually put their heads above the parapet and say, no, you know, this is not happening. We are going to stick our necks on the line and actually draw a line under this and say, no, we won't put up with this. We are going to challenge this. And I'm so grateful to those women. And I think they were so brave to be able to do that and to take that public stance. I mean, I guess the most high profile woman I'm thinking of, as I'm sure everybody knows, is J.K. Rowling. I mean, I think the fact that she, as such an incredibly influential and famous woman, did that, very, very brave thing to do. But I think it then made it far easier for other people to then say, yeah, I agree, you know, I also don't accept this, because they'd seen that J.K. Rowling had done it. They'd seen that other women had also spoken out about it. So I think that's a really important thing. I think the other thing, apart from bravery, in the UK, particularly with pushing back on in relation to transgenderism, is that it does come back to this idea of kind of crossing political boundaries, of the intellectual and the political diversity. So I think what's important about the pushback in relation to transgender in the UK is it's not seen as just being a right-wing thing. It's not just right-wing women who are standing up against transgender, the rise of transgender ideology, but women from across the political spectrum. You've got, I mean, J.K. Rowling is by no one's definition right-wing. You know, she has very liberal views in relation to feminism, in relation to immigration, for example. So it because of that, you know, it's not been easy to put the women who are standing up against this into a box. They can't just be said, oh, you know, this is just an obsession of the right wing, or this is just an obsession of this little group. It's seen as being a much broader thing. And I think that's very important. So two things I would take from it, you know, is be brave. I think people should all just try and be a bit braver when it comes to standing up to these things. And the second thing is find allies. You know, it's difficult perhaps for you as an individual to put your head above the parapet and challenge these things. But if you can align with other people, maybe other people who politically you don't even agree on everything, but you agree on just the one thing, it becomes much easier to stand up when you know that there are other people who share the same view that you do too.
And you mentioned another thing also in your book that might be important in this struggle, that you said the wokers, by the end of the day, they carry very little substance. They don't really deliver the goods. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I think certainly few people would say that society is less racist or less sexist or less homophobic now than it was 5 years ago. They have to keep on kind of reinventing or finding new forms of racism and sexism to justify their continued authority. So I guess in that way, they can't ever really show that they've been successful, even in their own terms. But I think another important thing, I think more and more, is that the whole ideas around cancel culture, censoring people, curtailing free speech, is really a sign of political cowardice on behalf of woke people. If they thought that their ideas really were correct and could withstand scrutiny and carried moral authority, they wouldn't need to ban speakers from universities or stop comedians speaking at particular venues. They'd be like, well, our ideas are the best ideas anyway. We know you're wrong. We know we're right. Bring it on. I'm happy to engage in these debates and this discussion. The very fact they have to resort to censorship seems to me exposes the weakness in their arguments, and it exposes their own insecurities and the kind of failure that they've had to win people over by the weight of their arguments. And I think that's understandable, because arguing something like, I'm not going to judge people according to the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character, is a really powerful moral message that speaks to common humanity, speaks to being genuinely against racism, genuinely wanting to kind of overcome and move beyond these ideas, backward ideas, and look at a world that it trivializes race as unimportant, because it moves morally beyond that to look at what people are like as individuals and as a collective, and what people have got in common. Whereas they must know that their ideas are backward in the sense of rehabilitating racial thinking, rehabilitating sexist stereotypes, rehabilitating homophobia. So they've always got this fallback to authoritarianism to impose these ideas, because there's nothing inspirational there. There's nothing attractive about these ideas.
So the future is not woke?
I hope not. I really, really hope not. And certainly long term, I can't see how these ideas can sustain and win out. But I think there's a battle ahead of us. And, I think we have to be up for this, and we have to take the fight to other people, knowing that we have the kind of moral credibility on our side.
Joanna Williams, I want to thank you so much for being on the program, and hope to talk to you again someday.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.